But in spite of the attempt in contemporary discourse to link the terms humanism and humanity together, one must understand the very different senses they have had historically if one wants to trace their roots. There's a useful historical sketch of the concept of humanism by Vito Giustiniani that describes the different values the term evoked in the Italian Renaissance, in mid-19th century Germany, and in late 19th century America. But I won't elaborate on this history here, except to stress that differences among human beings have always been perceived in different ways. For example, in Renaissance Europe, cultural relativists saw differences as original, and degenerationists, as they were called, insisted on an original unity. It was Christian moralists who emphasized the humanity of all so-called savages and endorsed missionizing efforts. But seeing non-Christians as actually or potentially human because they were worthy of being converted to the Christian faith meant seeing difference as incompleteness, and thus making the direction of progress depend on a particular ideological choice. Making a place for savagery at first meant a place in scholasticism's hierarchy of being. Once safely there in the shelter of this world picture and upheld by schoolman's logic, the African or Native American was no longer a stranger or anomaly, no longer a threat to the accepted envisagement of the organization of things, but kin to everything in nature, to man, to the animals, and to the angels. Gradually, two old ideas came to be fused together: the hierarchical principle of the arrangement of things and the temporal principle of historical development. But neither the sense of the human nor the behavior towards others that it stipulated remained constant. How did Europeans actually treat the humans they conquered in the process of creating world empires? There were those who acted what we would call humanely, and those who didn't. In the New World, Bartolomeo de las Casas and Hernando Cortés famously represent this contrast. Tsvetan Todorov, discussing these two figures in his well-known book, The Conquest of America, writes, "The efficiency of colonialism is greater than that of enslavement. At least that is what we can observe today. It is true that many things separate the two men. Las Casas loves the Indians, but does not always understand them. Cortés knows them in his way, even if he does not bear any great love toward them. His attitude toward Indian enslavement illustrates this position nicely. Las Casas is against the repartiamento, the feudal secession of the Indians to the Spaniards, which Cortés, on the contrary, promotes. And yet, Las Casas and Cortés are in agreement on one essential point: the subjugation of America to Spain, the annexation of the Indians to the Christian religion, the preference for colonialism over enslavement." So Todorov reminds us that different attitudes to humans can issue from a single vision of the human as convertible. With the publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in the 19th century, the evolutionary framework in which humanity was now placed came to be further developed, particularly by Herbert Spencer, who popularized the idea of social evolution. Even among those who didn't resort to racial explanation, the Victorian notion of the human produced by theories of social and cultural evolution was, as so often, often as not, a way of excluding categories of persons. The specific attraction of evolutionary social theories was that they offered a way of reformulating the essential unity of mankind, while avoiding the current objections to the older theories of a human nature everywhere essentially the same. Mankind was not one because it was everywhere the same, but because the differences represented different stages in the same process. And by agreeing to call the process progress, one could convert the social theory into a moral and political one. What had once been a narrow Christian civilization was now, in its secular form, become the epitome of an all-inclusive humanity. Toward the end of the 19th century, James Lorimer, perhaps the most important theoretician of the newly emerging discipline of international law at the time, argued that since the idea of political organization was European, only European polities could be recognized as states, and that barbaric or savage communities must be seen as collections of individuals in their capacity as human. The idea of human rights was thus used to define an incomplete status. It's not surprising, therefore, that most 19th century international lawyers agreed that while individual non-Europeans could be said to possess human rights, their communities had no such rights. Since sovereignty, it was said, was a European concept intrinsic to its international system of law, and therefore applicable only to the European states within that system, it didn't belong to non-European societies and could not therefore be transferred to the European power that annexed them. 19th century international lawyers who adopted an evolutionary perspective saw their movement as the organ of the juridical conscience of the civilized world, a standpoint in which much more is involved than mere prejudice, because it was precisely this that allowed them to invoke universality as a principle, but treat actual situations in their particularity. The idea of humanity has enabled many kinds of discourse and practice that depend on its particular content, particularities that contributed to the formation of the national and civilizational self. Since the Christian Middle Ages, theological discourses defined particular relations with specific others. Muslims weren't merely excluded, it was necessary that they be addressed as enemies. Jews constituted a more complicated other, at once a source of theological confirmation and a standing theological affront. In other words, the Christian idea of the character of humanity wasn't simply a limited version of what later came to be an all-inclusive secularized category. It articulated a particular political theological culture founded on feelings of fear, anxiety, and hostility towards outsiders, as well as occasional curiosity about their lives.